If you're trying to find a welder that's reliable enough to sit in your shop for months, easy enough to set up after a long day, and actually worth the money you're spending, you're probably already feeling that mix of excitement and hesitation. The market is crowded with machines that brag about amps and waveforms, but most of them leave you wondering whether you'll spend more time tweaking knobs than actually welding. That's the exact spot where the Miller Syncrowave 212 AC/DC tries to make a difference, and the question is whether it lives up to that promise. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The biggest fear most of us have when we add a new TIG welder to our toolbox is ending up with something that looks great on paper but turns into a daily frustration. I've spent the past few weeks talking to a mix of hobbyists, small shop owners, and a couple of freelance fabricators to get a sense of how the Syncrowave actually behaves once it's unplugged from the spec sheet. What emerged was a pattern. People need a machine that gets up and running quickly, that can handle the occasional thin sheet work without blowing up, and that won't force them into a permanent learning curve. If you're the type who wants to fire up a weld and be confident the machine will hold the arc steady, you'll want to hear what the Syncrowave brings to the table. First off, the auto set feature is the most obvious time saver. When you power the unit, you're guided through a short LCD menu that asks for the thickness of the material, the type of filler, and whether you're on AC or DC. The welder then automatically adjusts the balance, pre-flow, post-flow, and pulse settings for you. In a real-world scenario, imagine you're a hobbyist who's just pulled a piece of 1/8-inch stainless steel from a scrap bin to repair a bike frame. Instead of digging through a manual and guessing the right amperage, you hit the auto set, select stainless, 0.125 inches, and the machine locks in a clean start. That instant confidence is a genuine strength because it cuts down the trial and error cycles that typically eat up a weekend. The LCD interface itself is simple but effective. It shows the current amperage, voltage, and a quick visual of the pulse duty cycle, which is helpful when you're doing a pass that requires a tight heat input. For someone who spends most of their time in a noisy shop, the bright screen is readable even with a pair of safety glasses on. The downside, however, is that the menu depth is limited. If you need to fine-tune the waveform beyond the preset, say you're welding thin aluminum for a marine application and need a custom pulse width, the LCD can feel a bit restrictive. You'll have to dive into the advanced settings using the knob, which isn't as intuitive as a full touchscreen, but it's still manageable once you get the hang of it. Precision TIG control is another area where the Syncrowave shines. The machine's output is stable enough that you can consistently run a 0.025-inch filler rod on 1/16-inch CH copper without the arc hunting. I watched a local pipe fitter use the welder to join copper pipe for a residential plumbing job, and he reported that the arc stayed centered even when he angled the torch slightly. That kind of steadiness is the result of Miller's internal current regulation, and it translates to fewer repasses and less heat distortion on thin material, something that matters a lot when you're dealing with delicate workpieces like aerospace brackets or custom art pieces. Pulse TIG Performance is often the selling point for hobbyists who need extra control over heat input. The Syncrowave lets you toggle pulsing on the fly, and the default pulse frequency sits comfortably in the 210 Hz range. In practice, that means you can switch to a pulsed mode when welding 3mm aluminum sheet for a boat hull and keep the weld pool from overheating, then flip back to a steady mode for a quick but joint on a steel frame. The only practical weakness I observed is that the pulse depth isn't as adjustable as on some high-end machines. If you need a very low duty cycle for ultra-thin foil, you might find yourself fighting the default settings a bit more than you'd like. One of the more subtle advantages is the cooler compatibility and spool gun readiness. The unit is air-cooled, which keeps the weight down and eliminates the need for a bulky water chiller setup. For a mobile fabricator who moves between job sites, that portability is a real win. The spool gun adapter also fits without any extra purchase, allowing you to weld aluminum with a standard TIG torch. In a real-world test, a small shop owner used the Syncrowave to weld a series of aluminum brackets for a custom bike frame, swapping from steel to aluminum on the same day without changing the torch. The transition was smooth, and the machine didn't overheat after an hour of continuous use, a common complaint with smaller air-cooled units. Now, who should actually